The sound of the slap echoed through the marble courtroom like a thunderclap, silencing every whisper, stopping every breath, freezing time itself, as Eleanor Hastings, the dignified wife of billionaire Marcus Hastings, stood motionless, her porcelain cheek flushed red, her eyes wide with shock, while across from her, trembling and tearful, stood Vivian Cole, the woman who had just struck her in front of a judge, 2 attorneys, and a gallery of stunned onlookers. But before the bailiff could move, before the lawyers could object, before Eleanor could even process what had happened, Judge Catherine Morrison, a silver-haired woman known for her unshakable composure, rose from her bench, her face pale, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "Vivian Cole," and the way she said it, with such heartbreak and recognition, made everyone in that room realize that something far deeper than a divorce case was about to unfold. 3 months earlier, Eleanor Hastings had been the picture of perfection, or at least that's what the society pages had always written about her, the elegant wife who had stood beside Marcus for 23 years, who had raised their daughter Charlotte with grace, who had attended every charity gala in designer gowns, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, a smile that hid the loneliness of being married to a man who loved his empire more than his family. Eleanor had always known that Marcus was distant, always traveling, always closing deals, always choosing boardrooms over birthdays, but she had made peace with it, or so she told herself during those long nights in their sprawling estate, where the silence was so thick it felt like drowning. Then came the day she found the receipts not hidden, not secret, just carelessly left in his jacket pocket, receipts for her apartment she'd never seen, jewelry she'd never received, dinners at intimate restaurants she'd never visited, and her hands had trembled as she sat in their bedroom, the room where they hadn't touched each other in years, and realized that her marriage had been a ghost long before another woman had entered the picture. She hired a lawyer, filed for divorce, and prepared herself for the battle, telling herself she would be strong, that she would walk away with her dignity intact, that she would finally be free. The divorce proceedings were cold, and procedural Marcus barely looked at her during the hearings. His lawyers fought over assets and investments, and Eleanor sat in those courtrooms feeling like her entire life was being reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet, until the day that Vivian Cole appeared. Vivian wasn't what Eleanor had expected. She wasn't a young seductress dripping with ambition and designer labels. She wasn't the cliched mistress from the movies. Instead, she was a thin, fragile-looking woman in her early 30s with dark circles under her eyes, wearing a simple gray dress that had seen better days, clutching a worn purse against her chest like a shield. And when she entered the courtroom for the hearing about the division of Marcus's assets, Eleanor felt something unexpected, not rage, but a strange, unsettling curiosity about who this woman really was. Vivian's attorney, a public defender who looked overwhelmed, explained that his client had a financial claim related to Mr. Hastings, that there were promises made, contracts signed, and Marcus's high-powered legal team immediately moved to dismiss, calling it a frivolous claim, a desperate attempt at extortion. But Judge Morrison allowed Vivian to speak. Standing at the podium, Vivian's voice shook as she explained that she had met Marcus 2 years ago when she was working as a night nurse at a private medical facility, that he had been kind to her during a difficult time, that he had promised to help her, to invest in a small medical clinic she dreamed of opening for underserved communities, that she had trusted him, and yes, she admitted with shame coloring her cheeks, she had made the terrible mistake of believing that his attention meant something more. "I'm not here for money," Vivian said, her voice cracking. "I'm here because he promised to help sick children, and instead he used my designs, my research, and opened the clinic under his corporation's name, cutting me out entirely. I just want what was promised to the community, not to me." Eleanor watched this woman, this stranger who had somehow become entangled in Marcus's web just as she had been decades ago, and felt the first crack in the wall of anger she'd built around her heart. But Marcus's lead attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Brennan, stood and systematically destroyed Vivian's credibility. He brought up her financial struggles, her lack of formal business education, suggested she had been a willing participant in an affair and was now simply experiencing regret. And with each word, Vivian seemed to shrink, to fold into herself until she was barely visible. Then Brennan made his final strike, presenting photographs of Vivian and Marcus at a restaurant, walking together, entering the apartment. And he said with cold precision, "Miss Cole, isn't it true that you engaged in an intimate relationship with Mr. Hastings with the express purpose of gaining financial advantage?" And Vivian's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "I was lonely and stupid, and I thought someone finally saw me." That's when Eleanor stood up. She didn't plan to. Her body just moved, and she walked across the courtroom, past her own attorneys, who whispered urgently for her to sit down, past Marcus, who looked at her with something between surprise and fear, and she stood directly in front of Vivian. These two women whose lives had been shaped and broken by the same man, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. Eleanor saw herself in Vivian's eyes, the same hope that had been manipulated, the same trust that had been betrayed, the same loneliness that made you vulnerable to anyone who offered the illusion of being seen. And she said, quietly but clearly, "I believe you." The courtroom erupted. Brennan objected. The judge called for order. But Eleanor didn't move, and neither did Vivian, who stared at her with such raw confusion and gratitude that it hurt to witness. "Mrs. Hastings, please return to your seat," Judge Morrison said, not unkindly, and Eleanor nodded. But as she turned to walk away, Vivian reached out and grabbed her wrist, a desperate, impulsive gesture, and said, "You don't understand. I'm not asking for your pity. I don't deserve your kindness. I helped destroy your marriage." And something inside Vivian seemed to snap, all the guilt and shame and self-hatred pouring out as she said, "You're this perfect, elegant woman with everything, and I'm nothing. I've always been nothing, and I hate that he made me feel like I could be something when all I was to him was." And that's when her hand flew up and struck Eleanor across the face. The slap wasn't hard, but the shock of it reverberated through the room, and Vivian immediately stepped back, her hand covering her mouth in horror at what she'd just done, while Eleanor stood frozen, her cheeks stinging, her mind trying to process the pain that had just lashed out at her in the form of Vivian's palm. The bailiff moved forward. Brennan was shouting about assault. Vivian was sobbing and apologizing, and Eleanor just stood there, raising her hand to her face, feeling the heat of the impact. But instead of anger, she felt something else, a deep, aching sadness for both of them, for all the ways Marcus had pitted them against each other, for all the ways women were taught to blame each other instead of the man who had betrayed them both. And then Judge Morrison stood, her face drained of color, and said, "Vivian, Vivian Cole," in a voice so filled with emotion that everyone fell silent. The judge stepped down from the bench, something Eleanor had never seen a judge do in all her court appearances, and she walked slowly toward Vivian, studying her face with an intensity that made the younger woman stop crying and look up in confusion. "How old are you?" Judge Morrison asked, her voice trembling. 32, Vivian whispered. "When's your birthday?" "March 14th. The judge's hand went to her chest, and she closed her eyes for a moment, seeming to gather herself, before asking, "Do you know anything about your birth parents?" And Vivian's face went pale. I was adopted," Vivian said slowly. "I was told my mother was very young, that she couldn't keep me. I've never." "Why are you asking me this?" Judge Morrison's eyes filled with tears, and she said, "Because 32 years ago, I gave birth to a daughter on March 14th. I was 17 years old. My parents forced me to give her up. I was told I'd never be able to find her, that the adoption was sealed, and I have spent every single day of my life wondering where she was, if she was happy, her voice broke, if she knew that I never stopped loving her. The courtroom was absolutely silent, every person barely breathing as they witnessed this impossible, devastating moment of recognition. Vivian was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face, saying, "No, no. That's not how do you." And Judge Morrison pulled out her phone with trembling hands, showing Vivian a photograph of herself at 17, and even from where Eleanor stood, she could see the resemblance, the same dark eyes, the same delicate bone structure, the same way of holding pain in the curve of their mouths. "I've been searching for you through every legal channel for 15 years, since I became a judge and thought I might have the resources to find you," Catherine said, her professional composure completely shattered. "I hired investigators, I filed petitions, but the adoption records were sealed so tightly. I never knew your adoptive name, I only knew your birth date and the hospital. And now you're standing in my courtroom, and she couldn't finish." And Vivian collapsed into the nearest chair, her whole body shaking as 32 years of wondering about her origins crashed into the surreal present. Eleanor stood, witnessing this miraculous, heartbreaking reunion, and her own pain suddenly felt smaller, or perhaps not smaller, but part of a much larger tapestry of human suffering and love and loss that connected all of them in ways they couldn't have imagined. The hearing was immediately adjourned. The courtroom cleared, but Eleanor didn't leave. She couldn't. Something kept her rooted to the spot as she watched Judge Morrison and Vivian sit together in the empty gallery, talking in hushed, tearful voices, beginning the impossible process of becoming mother and daughter after 3 decades of absence. Marcus approached Eleanor, actually looking uncomfortable for the first time in years, and said, "Eleanor, I didn't know about any of this, with her mother I mean, and about the clinic. There may have been some miscommunication with my team. I can have them." But Eleanor held up her hand, stopping him. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't make excuses. Don't try to fix this with money or lawyers. Just don't." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the powerful billionaire that society pages celebrated, but a small, lonely man who had spent so long building walls around himself that he'd forgotten how to be human. "You hurt us both, Marcus, and you'll have to live with that," Eleanor said. "But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being defined by what you did or didn't do. I'm going to be free of you, truly free, and I hope someday you'll figure out what actually matters." She turned to walk away, but then stopped and looked back at Vivian, who was still sitting with her newly discovered mother. And Eleanor made a decision that surprised even herself. Over the next 3 weeks, as the legal proceedings were sorted out, as Marcus's lawyers were forced to acknowledge the legitimate contract for the community clinic, as the divorce was finalized, with Eleanor receiving a substantial but not vindictive settlement, as Judge Morrison recused herself from the case and another judge took over, Eleanor did something unexpected. She reached out to Vivian. It started with a simple letter, delivered through Vivian's attorney, in which Eleanor wrote, "I don't know if you'll want to hear from me, and I don't know exactly why I'm writing, except that I keep thinking about that moment in the courtroom, about the pain in your eyes that I recognized, because I've carried it too, and I want you to know that I don't blame you. I did, for a while, but I understand now that we were both trying to survive loneliness in whatever way we could, and Marcus exploited that in both of us. I hope you're finding peace with your mother. I hope the clinic becomes everything you dreamed." Vivian responded a week later, a handwritten note that said simply, "I'm sorry I hit you. I'm sorry for all of it. Thank you for seeing me as a person. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm grateful for it anyway." They began to meet, tentatively at first, for coffee at a quiet cafe, far from the society circles Eleanor used to inhabit, and these meetings were awkward and painful and somehow necessary too. Women untangling the mess of their connected betrayal, learning to see each other not as enemies but as fellow survivors. Vivian told Eleanor about her childhood in foster care before being adopted at age 7 by a kind but struggling couple who had done their best, about working her way through nursing school, about the dream of opening a clinic that would provide free medical care to children whose families couldn't afford it, about meeting Marcus during a night shift when he'd come to visit a business associate, and how his interest in her project hand, then in her had, felt like a miracle. I knew he was married, Vivian admitted, shame still coloring her voice. I told myself it was just professional, just about the clinic. But I was lying to myself because I wanted to feel special, wanted to feel chosen, and I made a terrible choice that hurt you, hurt myself, hurt everyone. Eleanor listened, and in Vivian's story, she heard echoes of her own younger self, the girl who had married Marcus at 21, believing that his attention meant love, that his wealth would equal security, that she could build a life in the spaces he left empty. I made myself small for so long, Eleanor confessed. I thought if I was perfect enough, elegant enough, undemanding enough, he would finally see me. But you can't make someone love you by disappearing. And I disappeared piece by piece until I barely recognized myself. Through these conversations, something unexpected happened. They became friends, or something close to it, bound by shared experience and the strange intimacy of having touched the same broken places. Vivian introduced Eleanor to Catherine, her birth mother, and the three women began meeting together, forming an unlikely circle of support as Catherine and Vivian navigated their reunion, as Eleanor navigated her new life as a divorced woman, as they all learned that healing wasn't linear or simple, but required patience and honesty, and the willingness to sit with discomfort. Catherine shared her own story, the trauma of being forced to give up her baby, the years of law school and building a career while carrying the secret grief of a daughter she'd lost, the failed marriages, because she couldn't fully give her heart when part of it was always with a child. She'd never known, and Eleanor realized that everyone carried invisible wounds, that the composed judge and the struggling nurse and the society wife were all just women who had survived the best they could. 6 months after the courtroom slap, on a bright autumn morning, Eleanor stood outside a newly renovated building in an underserved neighborhood on the city's east side, watching as workers hung a sign that read Cole Community Children's Clinic in cheerful blue letters. Vivian stood beside her, wearing scrubs and a white coat, her face transformed with joy and purpose, and Eleanor felt a deep satisfaction knowing that she had helped make this possible. After the legal settlement, after Marcus had been forced to honor his original contract, there had still been a significant funding gap, and Eleanor had quietly written a check from her divorce settlement to cover it, not out of pity, but out of a genuine belief in the work Vivian was doing, and perhaps out of a desire to transform something painful into something meaningful. I don't know how to thank you, Vivian said for the 100th time, and Eleanor smiled, shaking her head. You're giving children access to health care they desperately need, Eleanor said. That's thanks enough. Besides, this is the first thing I've invested in that actually matters. That's mine, and not just an extension of Marcus's empire or society's expectations. Charlotte, Eleanor's daughter, now 21 and home from college, joined them for the clinic's opening, and Eleanor watched as Charlotte and Vivian talked about the medical programs, about community outreach, about dreams for expansion, and she felt proud that her daughter was witnessing this, seeing that women could choose collaboration over competition, healing over hatred, that the worst moments of life could become catalysts for transformation. If you were brave enough to let them. Marcus was not invited to the opening, and in fact, Eleanor had barely spoken to him since the divorce was finalized. He had moved on quickly, as men like him always did, to another business venture, another city, another version of the same empty life. But she had heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd attended therapy, that he'd actually called Charlotte and apologized for being an absent father. that perhaps the public humiliation of the trial had cracked something open in him too, though Eleanor knew that his journey was his own and no longer her concern. Judge Catherine Morrison, who had taken a temporary leave from the bench to spend time with her daughter, gave a short speech at the clinic opening, her voice steady but emotional as she said, "This place represents second chances for the children who will receive care here, for the community that will be served, for all of us who have learned that it's never too late to fight for what's right, to choose love over bitterness, to find family in unexpected places." She looked at Vivian with such open love that Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. And then Catherine did something that surprised everyone. She looked at Eleanor and said, "I want to thank Eleanor Hastings, who could have chosen revenge but chose compassion, who turned her pain into purpose, who showed all of us what grace really looks like." The small crowd applauded, and Eleanor felt embarrassed and moved and somehow lighter than she'd felt in decades, as if forgiving Vivian and Marcus not for their sake, but for her own had released a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. That evening, after the opening celebration, Eleanor returned to her new apartment, smaller than the estate she'd left, but filled with furniture she'd chosen, art she loved, space that was entirely hers. And she sat by the window watching the city lights, thinking about the woman she'd been 6 months ago. The woman who had stood in that courtroom with a red mark on her cheek and a choice before her. She had chosen to see Vivian's humanity, to reach across the divide of hurt and blame, to recognize that they were not enemies, but casualties of the same emotional war, and that choice had changed everything. Her phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "Thank you for today, for everything. You gave me back my life." Eleanor smiled and typed back, "You helped me find mine." It was true in the process of forgiving Vivian, of helping her build the clinic, of witnessing her reunion with Catherine. Eleanor had discovered parts of herself that had been dormant for years, her strength, her agency, her capacity for generosity that wasn't about appearing charitable, but about genuinely caring. She had spent so long being Marcus's wife, being Charlotte's mother, being the elegant woman in the society pages, that she had forgotten to be Eleanor, to ask what Eleanor wanted, what Eleanor dreamed, what Eleanor's life could look like if she built it on her own terms. Now, at 44 years old, she was beginning again, and it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She had enrolled in classes on nonprofit management, thinking she might want to do more work like what Vivian was doing. She had started painting again, a hobby she'd abandoned years ago. She had traveled alone to places Marcus had never wanted to visit, and she was slowly, carefully, learning to take up space in the world without apologizing for it. Charlotte called her one night and said, "Mom, I'm really proud of you. You know that. You could have been bitter and angry, and you would have had every right to be. But instead, you became ... more generous, more yourself, more alive. You taught me that the worst things that happen to us don't have to define us." Eleanor cried when she heard that, the good kind of crying that releases rather than burdens. And she realized that perhaps this was the gift hidden inside the betrayal. The chance to show her daughter that women don't have to diminish themselves to be loved, that ending a marriage isn't a failure, but sometimes the bravest form of that transformation is always possible if you're willing to do the hard, uncomfortable work of choosing differently. A year after the slap, Eleanor, Vivian, and Catherine had dinner together at a small Italian restaurant, an annual tradition they'd decided to establish to mark the anniversary of the day. Their lives had intersected in that courtroom. They talked and laughed and shared stories. And at one point, Vivian raised her glass and said, "To the worst and best day of my life, the day I hit rock bottom and found my mother and discovered that some people are kind, even when you don't deserve it." Catherine raised her glass and added, "To finding what was lost and learning that family isn't just blood, it's also choice." Eleanor raised her glass last and said, "2 second chances, to choosing forgiveness, to women who refuse to be divided by the men who hurt them, and to the truth that we're all stronger than we think. They clinked glasses. 3 women whose lives had been broken and remade, who had learned that the slap that echoed through that courtroom wasn't really an act of violence but a desperate cry for help, a breaking point that became a turning point, a moment of pain that transformed into a catalyst for healing. As Eleanor walked home that night through the lamplit streets, she thought about the question she'd been asked so many times over the past year by friends, by journalists curious about the dramatic trial, by people who didn't understand. How could you forgive her? How could you help the woman who slept with your husband? And Eleanor's answer was always the same, though people rarely seemed to understand it, because holding on to hatred would have poisoned me, not her, and because I realized that Vivian wasn't my enemy. Manipulation was. A society that teaches women to compete for male attention instead of supporting each other was in. I refused to let those things win. She had learned that forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about refusing to let the hurt control your future, about choosing freedom over the bitter satisfaction of being right, about recognizing that everyone is fighting battles you can't see and showing grace even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The slap had been shocking, yes, but it had cracked something open: Lenore's carefully constructed facade of perfection, Vivian's self-hatred and isolation, the courtroom's expectation of how a scorned wife should behave. And through that crack, light had come in, the light of truth and connection, and the possibility of becoming something new. Eleanor reached her building, took the elevator to her floor, unlocked her door and stepped into her quiet, peaceful apartment. And she felt something she hadn't felt in decades: contentment. The deep, simple satisfaction of being exactly who she was, where she was, without apology or pretense. Tomorrow she would wake up and continue building her new life. She would video call Charlotte. She would meet with the nonprofit she was now consulting for. She would maybe go to the art supply store and buy new canvases. She would exist in the world as a whole person, rather than a fragment of someone else's story. And that, she thought, as she got ready for bed, was the real victory. Not winning in court, not the settlement, not the revenge she could have taken but didn't, but this quiet reclaiming of herself, this gentle revolution of choosing compassion and watching it transform not just Vivian's life or Catherine's, but most importantly, her own. The last thing Eleanor did before falling asleep was look at a photograph on her nightstand, a picture taken at the clinic opening of her, Vivian, and Catherine standing together, arms around each other, smiling. 3 women who had every reason to be strangers or enemies, but who had chosen, against all odds and expectations, to be family instead, proving that the most powerful force in the world isn't money or status or even romantic love, but the courageous decision to see each other's humanity and respond with kindness, even when, especially when it's the hardest thing to do.